This week we are talking about analytical theories. And these play out of what we've already discussed with Freud and Adler as some of the earliest people. One of the theories that we'll talk about this week is Gestalt therapy with Fritz Perls. And in our textbook, it's described as kind of an existential theory, and that it is, and we'll kind of see how it plays out with the groups of theories that we talk about with existential theories. But I have put Gestalt and analytical theory or analytical psychotherapy, talking about analytical theories. These relate very closely to what we discussed previously with Freud and Adler and the early theories. Analytical theory that was developed by Carl Jung is very important, as you're going to see this week, as it really relates to understanding the human personality. Much of what we know today, or we still think about, the temperament and personality types. If you've ever taken a Myers-Briggs or something like that had a personality type with it, most of the time those ideas about temperament or temperament analysis come out of Jungian therapy and the types that you will read about in the textbook this week. And so there's a lot that I think we understand about the human personality that might have been closer to our understanding of the true human personality of anything that we will see that's related to analytical therapy and Carl Jung. And those thoughts and those ideas are still in vogue today and used quite frequently, particularly as we think about the human personality. And a part of what Jung did in understanding that, and as you will see, it was some of the same ideas of analysis that related to understanding the personality that you saw come out of psychoanalysis, dream analysis, those kinds of things. And this idea of a dark side, or the way that Jung put the personality together is that essentially we have a side of us that is that upfront facade that we present to the world, but then there is a darker side, or kind of the opposite side of the coin for all of us. And so we kind of understand that in terms of probably how we are put together as Christians, that we have a sin nature, and that there is a part of us that we want the world to see that we are good and we're altruistic and moral, but then there's also this dark side that kind of controls us. We call that the sin nature. But certainly in Jungian therapy, it's very helpful with what you put out there, that we understand kind of the human temperament and the thoughts that go with that. The other theory that we're talking about this week is Gestalt therapy. And I think Gestalt therapy is also very interesting. And one of the things about Gestalt therapy that I think you will see this week is it is heavily technique oriented. If you ever have, or you're interested, watching a video, it's an old video, and you can pull these up. I use these in some of my classes to get people to watch them. But it is an interview by some of the early theorists with a client named Gloria. Carl Rogers interviews Gloria, Fritz Perls interviews Gloria, and Albert Ellis in this video. And you see their different styles of dealing with a client. But in this video, you see how Perls really uses these kind of technique-y, speaking, reflective kinds of things. And so one of the things that you see a lot of come out of Gestalt therapy is a conceptual framework for helping people see things. As you look at Gestalt therapy, Gestalt is the German word for whole, and there's a lot of holism and holistic ideas about us being an integrated kind of person in our thinking. One of the things that you will see are the backgrounds of the perceptual work um, in Gestalt therapy. And one of the things that you have probably seen over the years, if you have seen pictures of perceptual tricks, I guess you might call them, where you look at the picture and you look at it in one perspective and you see an old lady, you look at it in another perspective, you see a young lady. There's one where it looks like a flower vase when you just look at it. And if you look at it coming from a different perspective, it looks like two faces looking at each other, facing each other. And so that perspective of how you see, and that it's called figure formation. Um, what it meant and how Fritz Perls talks about this is, in psychotherapy and in the work that he did in an analysis was, what are you seeing? What part of the world and the perspective of the world are you seeing? That relates a lot to cognitive therapy. And the reason a part of this is called or relates to existential therapy, and a lot of times he's placed among the existentialists, is because it talks about our meaning and gathering meaning and how we see ourselves in the world and how we see ourselves fitting into the world and the construct of the world. And so that was very important from the process of Fritz Perls. One of the things that I do, and I think a lot of counselors do, is we still use a number of the techniques that come out of Gestalt therapy and that Perls developed. One of the ones that I've used a lot and still use today with people is called the empty chair, in which you try to get a person to see that perspective of interaction process by placing the client across from an empty chair and letting the client go back and forth between those chairs and take on the perspective of the other person and to basically have a conversation with that person from one chair to the other. And what that does in terms of the what we were talking about, the figure formation kind of thing, it actually allows that person to take a perspective that they may have, and when they're moving to the seat of the other person, to begin to see the perspective of the other person and to take into consideration ideas and thoughts and possibilities that might be reflective of where the other person is or what maybe they're thinking or what they were doing when they said something or did something. And so it really allows you, and you see in that empty chair technique, that idea of the shifting of the perspective. And that's very helpful, I think, for anyone to be able to do that. I've even used the empty chair technique when we've had situations where I was working with a group of people or a family, and maybe one person wouldn't be there, maybe because of death or just an inability to be present in the meeting or in that session. And I've brought an empty chair in and allowed the family or allowed people as part of that group to take on the perspective of that person who might be in that empty chair. And so I use that a lot, and I think a lot of therapists do. Sometimes I think a lot of counselors don't use it correctly, but I think when you use that empty chair technique and some of these techniques that Fritz Perls used and are described in our textbook, they're still very effective, particularly when you're dealing with a person's perspective. Cognitive therapists that we'll get to later would describe that as a way of a kind of a flawed thinking or a problem or faulty kind of logic that a person may have. And so we're trying to help them see something different. And so even though probably these two therapies, analytical therapy of Carl Jung and Gestalt therapy, I would say are probably two of the most underrepresented therapies that may be out there today. The ideas that we gathered from Perls and his understanding of the human perspective and tied these into what we know about sensory input and processing are particularly important, and the techniques that come out of Gestalt therapy. And then also what we have learned from Carl Jung about our types and about the personality. Again, I think possibly Carl Jung hit the personality and what we would call some understanding of a more of a current understanding of the human personality, or a modern idea of what the human personality may be like. It's probably better than anything we've ever had, and we still have. Even our tests, even the psychological tests that we have today, a lot of them in terms of measuring personality, like I mentioned, the Myers-Briggs, those types of tests are based on the work of Carl Jung. Obviously, he came out of the group with Freud and Adler and Jung. As I know you're reading, Carl Jung and Adler both pretty quickly broke away from Sigmund Freud, mainly because Freud just insisted that their group, that Wednesday group in Vienna, and then the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society later, really were just going to be targeted toward Freud's ideas, and they were not going to be able to budge from that. And so they kind of began to move away from that. But still so influential. And again, as you will see, things that aren't just past ideas, but conceptual ideas that are mentioned in these theories, that we still use today and still help us understand human temperament and human personality. And then also a lot of understanding perspective and how our perspective on life gathers our meaning and helps us develop purpose, which is what Fritz Perls talked about. And therefore, the idea behind that is why it is considered an existential kind of therapy along the way as well. But I've included it in these analytical ones because I believe it is the analysis of that framework and that processing, and the perspective that we get on the world that really helps us kind of see that. And then those technique things that really came out of the work of Perls and Gestalt therapy. So I hope you have a good time reading this week. I do know this is some really complex reading as we go through these therapies that I've mentioned. But again, I encourage you to read it and reread it and look at the basic concepts. This week is heavy reading, as there's a lot of material related to these topics this week. So I hope as you go through this week that you will gain some understanding and appreciation of these theories. As always, I wish you well during the week, and I pray that God will bless you through the course of